For decades, Iran and Israel existed in a state of deep hostility, a rivalry that played out in the shadows through cyber attacks, assassinations, and proxy conflicts across the Middle East. Israel watched with growing alarm as Iran steadily advanced its nuclear program, viewing it as a direct threat to its very existence. The tension was not new, but a slow-burning fire that had been stoked for years. After the United States withdrew from the International Nuclear Agreement in 2018, Iran accelerated its efforts, enriching uranium to levels that brought it perilously close to being able to build a nuclear weapon. This created a sense of urgency in Jerusalem, where leaders felt that time was running out to prevent what they saw as an unthinkable outcome. The stage for a direct confrontation was set long before the first shots of June 2025 were fired. A significant escalation occurred in April 2024, when Israel struck an Iranian consulate in Syria, killing senior military commanders. Iran responded by launching an unprecedented barrage of over 300 drones and missiles directly at Israel. Though most were intercepted, this event shattered a long-standing taboo, marking the first time the two nations had engaged in direct military fire. This dramatic exchange proved that the shadow war was over. The conflict was now dangerously out in the open, and both sides had shown they were willing to strike each other's homelands directly. By late 2024, a unique strategic window had opened for Israel. Its key adversaries in the region, Hamas and Hezbollah, had been significantly weakened by previous conflicts, and a ceasefire with Hezbollah in November 2024 had quieted Israel's northern border. Furthermore, the surprising collapse of the pro-Iranian Assad regime in Syria in December 2024 removed a critical piece of Iran's regional power structure. Suddenly, Iran's main allies near Israel were neutralized. This geopolitical shift, combined with a supportive administration in the United States under President Donald Trump, created what Israeli military planners saw as a fleeting opportunity to act decisively against the Iranian threat. This confluence of factors, Iran's nuclear progress, the precedent of direct attacks, and the strategic realignment in the region, made a major conflict feel almost inevitable. The long-standing Cold War between the two regional powers had reached its breaking point. The question was no longer if they would fight a direct war, but when and how it would begin. For Israel, the calculation was stark act now, while the conditions were favorable, or wait and face a potentially nuclear-armed Iran in a more complex and dangerous future. The decision was made to launch a preemptive strike, hoping to cripple Iran's capabilities before it was too late. The war began in the dead of night on June 13, 2025. Under the codename Operation Rising Lion, Israel launched one of the most complex and ambitious air campaigns in its history. Over 200 of its most advanced fighter jets, including F-35s, F-15s and F-16s, flew across the region to strike deep within Iranian territory. Their mission was twofold: to dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure and to eliminate its top military leadership. In a single devastating wave, they hit over 100 targets, from the nuclear facilities at Natanz and Isfahan to the headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, catching the Iranian regime completely by surprise. Iran's response was swift and furious, though not as effective as it had hoped. Over the next 5 days, it unleashed a volley of approximately 500 ballistic and cruise missiles toward Israel. While Israel's advanced air defense systems like the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 managed to intercept the vast majority of these incoming threats, they were not impenetrable. Around 50 missiles broke through the defensive shield, crashing into Israeli cities and neighborhoods. The impacts caused significant destruction, killing over 24 people, wounding thousands, and forcing tens of thousands to evacuate their homes as the reality of a full-scale war set in for the Israeli public. The Israeli airstrikes achieved a stunning success in their goal of decapitating Iran's military command. The initial assault killed a roster of the country's most powerful military figures, including the Chief of Staff, Mohammad Bagheri, and the commander of the IRGC, Hossein Salami. Also killed was Esmail Ghani, the head of the elite Quds force responsible for Iran's foreign operations. The coordinated elimination of these leaders, along with hundreds of other senior IRGC officers, sent the Iranian military apparatus into a state of chaos, leaving it disorganized and struggling to mount a coherent defense or counteroffensive in the critical first days of the war. As the conflict raged, the United States, which had been providing intelligence and support to Israel, decided to intervene directly. On June 22, the US military brought its immense firepower to bear, targeting Iran's most heavily fortified nuclear sites. American bombers dropped powerful bunker-busting bombs on facilities like the one buried deep underground at Fordow, which were too difficult for Israeli munitions to destroy. This direct American involvement signaled to the world the gravity of the conflict and dramatically escalated the pressure on the Iranian regime, demonstrating that its most prized and protected assets were not safe from attack. For the civilians living in Iran, the war was a terrifying nightmare. The initial Israeli airstrikes on Tehran felt like earthquakes, shaking buildings to their foundations and shattering the night with a series of thunderous explosions. Unlike in Israel, there were no public bomb shelters or sophisticated air raid siren systems to warn citizens of the incoming attacks. People were left completely exposed and vulnerable. Panic quickly gripped the capital as residents realized the war had arrived at their doorsteps. The city, normally bustling with life, began to empty as a mass exodus got underway, creating immense traffic jams that stretched for miles and lasted up to 12 hours. The war triggered a severe economic and humanitarian crisis within Iran. With the country under attack, the stock exchange shut down and vital imports of food and medicine ground to a halt. Severe shortages of essential goods became widespread. Fuel was strictly rationed, with civilians limited to just 15 or 30 liters, making it difficult for many to flee the cities or even perform daily tasks. The scarcity caused prices for basic necessities like food and water to surge, placing an unbearable burden on families who were already struggling under economic sanctions. The conflict crippled an already fragile economy, leaving ordinary people to bear the brunt of the hardship. International reaction to the war was a mixture of condemnation and cautious diplomatic maneuvering. Many world leaders called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, fearing the conflict could spiral into a wider regional war that would destabilize the entire Middle East. Global oil prices spiked amid fears of disruption to shipping in the Persian Gulf. Behind the scenes, frantic diplomatic efforts were underway, with nations like the United States playing a key role in trying to manage the escalation. The world watched with bated breath, hoping to contain the conflict before it could spread further and draw in other regional and global powers. The emotional toll on the Iranian people was complex and deeply divided. While many were terrified by the violence and destruction, some quietly expressed hope that the Israeli attacks would finally lead to the collapse of the oppressive regime they had lived under for so long. They saw the strikes against the IRGC not as an attack on their country, but as a blow against their rulers. However, this hope soon turned to despair. As the days wore on and the destruction mounted, it became clear that the war was primarily causing immense suffering for civilians without any guarantee of political change, leaving many feeling trapped and hopeless. After 12 harrowing days of intense fighting, the war came to an abrupt end. On June 23, 2025, US President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire had been brokered. The news was met with shock and anger by many Iranians who had endured the bombing in the hope that it would bring about the end of the regime. For them, the ceasefire felt like a betrayal. They had suffered immense loss and destruction, only to see the same government they despised remain in power. The feelings of humiliation, from being attacked by a foreign power, were now mixed with a profound sense of disappointment, and the bitter realization that their suffering had not led to liberation. The aftermath of the war left Iran deeply scarred, but with its ruling regime still intact. Satellite imagery confirmed that its nuclear program had been dealt a severe blow. Facilities like Natanz showed significant damage, setting back Iran's nuclear ambitions by several years. However, the program was not permanently destroyed. More significantly, the country's top military leadership had been completely wiped out, a loss that would take years, if not decades, to recover from. Iran was left weakened and isolated, but the fundamental structure of its government had survived the onslaught, ready to reassert its control. In the wake of the ceasefire, the Iranian regime, fearing internal dissent, moved quickly to tighten its grip on the population. The streets, which had been filled with fleeing civilians, were now dotted with an increased number of security checkpoints. Reports of arbitrary detentions and a harsher crackdown on any form of opposition grew, as the government sought to stamp out any embers of rebellion that the war may have ignited. The brief, chaotic window of the conflict closed, and was replaced by an atmosphere of heightened fear and repression making life even more difficult for those who dreamed of a different future for their country. The June 2025 war fundamentally altered the Middle East, but it did not resolve the underlying conflict. It proved that the long-running shadow war could erupt into direct, devastating conventional warfare. While this conflict was short, analysts warned that it was likely just one chapter in a much longer story. The Iranian regime, though weakened, would likely seek to rebuild its military and nuclear capabilities with a renewed sense of vengeance. The war left both Iran and Israel standing, but the peace that followed was fragile and tense, leaving the entire region living under the shadow of a future conflict that could be even more destructive.